Just get it. Now you're on.
I'm on. This is where I get nervous, and I know I need nervousness in order to do what I do. So welcome nervousness. And welcome everyone who's here. It's lovely. Having a great retreat weekend. Really enjoying it. And I'm giving a talk which will have some spaces in it for some reflection and discussion. And the title of the talk, in case you've not seen it, is Finding the Pure Land in the Heart of Suffering. So it's quite a strong title, really, and I hope I can live up to it. My plan is to talk about what's happened to me over the last 3 years. It's 3 years next month since Sundari died, and a lot has happened. And I've summarized to you over the last 2 years or more my journey, and I wanted to summarize at the beginning some key points and then take it into some new areas of learning for me. And as ever, I want to link the learning from my own experience with the learning that comes from Buddhist teachings that I investigate to put alongside my own experience. And this time I'm going to bring in some radical Christian teachings, because what I realize is that when we focus on death, and I'm going to focus on death in particular later on, a lot of our views on death are actually framed and influenced by the Christian culture that many of us live in. So I think Christian teachings are very relevant when we talk about how we feel about death, whatever religion we are, if we're brought up in a Christian culture. So that's my plan. So to go back to the beginning, Sundari died, as I said, nearly 3 years ago. And my memory of it is, even though I knew she could die, when it came, it was a complete shock. And it had a numbing intensity for me. I remember feeling Milan and Leah and I were with her when she died. And I'd had the last 12 hours with her when she couldn't really speak, but it was clear she was going to die. That's what the hospital staff were telling me. And then she died. And in that moment after she died, I thought, Sundari has just died. What now? It's like, it was really devastating. And I had no plan. Although I did have a plan, actually, because Leah and Milan joined me because I was told I could have someone with me. And I said, well, I want 2 people with me because they're a couple and they're both very close, and I couldn't choose between them. And that was agreed by the nurse, the senior sister. And so in a way, that was my first step towards being proactive, saying, these are the people I want with me. After, I didn't realize the significance at the time, but this was me beginning to set out some course for myself to deal with this. That was a disaster, really. And the other thing that was in the back of my mind when I wanted them there, not only had they lived with Sundari and I for 18 months, but they had a car, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to drive home afterwards. I need someone to take me home, and these are the people I want to take me home. So I was already thinking ahead, but enough to think, how am I going to deal with this? You know, I'm going to be numb. I won't be able to drive. I'll be devastated. And then the other thing that happened, it's one of the things that sticks with me about that experience of Sundari dying. I mean, I can say a lot of things about my contact with her and how that relationship played out, but I'm not going to say that now. What I'm going to say is there were 2 nurses with us when she died, and they were both extraordinary because they somehow were with us in a way that was with us. You know, they had a technical job to do. One of them was monitoring some equipment and telling me when she was near to death. But they were like colleagues. We became a team. And after Sundari had died, about 15 minutes after probably, and we were there, and the two nurses started sharing their own experience about how hard it had been for them during the pandemic when no family or relatives were allowed to be there, and how hard that had been with them. And they shared that experience. And that for me was another sort of setting something in place for going forward. It was like the kindness of strangers and our shared humanity, that sharing of experience as equals. You know, their professional identity was on one side, it wasn't relevant in that moment. And I think when I look back on it now, those experiences are really setting in place something that's really important, not consciously happening, but just happening. And that's what I'm wanting to pick out. So as you know, if you've been involved in a loved one dying, which probably many or most or even all of you have, after the person dies, it's busy period. You've got to have a funeral, a burial, you've got to do legal stuff. And all of that happened. And I was thinking, what was it about that that really set my course in place? And the first thing I knew was that Sundari needed a good send-off. And it was partly my job to do that. That's what I decided at the time. I've got to be proactive here. I've got to have an active role because she needs a good send-off. And I've got experiences in team building and gathering a group of people around me, and we're going to do that. And of course, Sestama was the first key person I came to as part of that team, along with Sue Hammersley, the Christian minister who was a co-celebrant in the funeral and the burial. So this was the building the team. And also because of Sundari's work, she worked with a lot of refugees, as you know. And there were several refugees, some of whom I knew and some I was about to meet, regarded her as their mother. And so they're key people in the grieving. So I knew it was my job to make sure they were welcome and they were part of the funeral. And those who couldn't be physically there, you know, we arranged for them to be live screened to another place where they could together join in the funeral service. And another aspect of me, because they were her children, they called her mother explicitly, some of them. It was my job to say yes to everything they wanted, which is totally not me. I'm someone who my first thought would be probably not. I'm not sure we can do that. But this was a situation where you just had to say yes. And I remember saying to someone at the time, I'm channeling Sundari at the moment. And that's sort of worn off quite a bit in the last 3 years. But at the time, you know, it's what I had. I knew I had to do that. And that's another sort of reflection for me of how right at the start I knew things had to be different to my normal self. And then the funeral service itself was quite extraordinary. And for me, a key part of it was that we played to everyone in the funeral service a Christian hymn that sung by Sundari herself, which I'd recorded her when she, in the middle of the night when she had been very ill and just come through something. She sang a hymn from her school hymn book, which was very moving for her. We played it in the funeral service. So that's probably why I'm bringing in Christian teachings now, because they were part of her life and in the background of my life, and maybe for many of us who don't even identify as Christian. So after all of that busyness, it's like, what now? What next? A lot of people, I think, experience this. And I had to have a path. I had to have some plan. And two things happened. One of them, I started looking for sort of relationships in other people that I'd lost. And I only discovered what I was doing relatively recently. I was actually about 6 months ago when a therapist in the UK called Julia Samuel, who's a specialist in grief therapy. In a talk she was giving, she said, one of the things we experience when a loved one dies is we experience the loss of the part of ourself that's unique to that relationship. And that's what I was experiencing, the part of myself that had no manifestation. And I was trying to find it in relationships with other people. And I sort of regret that, really. I can understand it, but I think it caused some difficulty. It was inappropriate for them and for me, and it was like it didn't work. So I was just aware of that. It wasn't anything dramatic. It's just in that moment of connection, I was looking for something that I wasn't finding anywhere. So that's one piece of learning. Another was, I think I knew from what I'd understood about loss that I needed to be proactive, I needed to learn, and I needed to be guided. And part of my familiar pattern from my teenage years it goes back to is sort of a insatiable curiosity and a sort of research outlook on life. So I set up establishing an action learning project, really. I know how to run projects. I know how to establish things. So I became an action researcher and established a lot of stuff that's still with me, actually. It's a bit like a new career. In fact, I said to someone recently, it's probably my final career, but a final career around death is probably quite a good one to finish on for personal reasons and for the reasons of wanting to help others. And then something that I discovered about 18 months ago, I was being interviewed for a documentary on stories from the pandemic that Compassionate Sheffield was making. And I was interviewed by the director, and he asked me a question, and I found myself saying that actually, shocking as it can be, death can be a gift. And I elaborated it a bit, and that was quite profound for me. And I managed to explain it, I think, on the film and to myself, because in that loss, that dreadful loss, I was broken open. That's the way you put it, Shastama. And in that broken openness, and in the sort of the various things I've said that were beginning to fall into place, something new emerged, and that was a gift to me, and possibly to others as well. And I was sort of saying this fairly recently to Ray, and Ray, who is better read on Pure Land Buddhism than I am, he said, well, better read on much Buddhism. He said, that's the third noble truth, Nirodha. That broken open, that openness to the gift that's emerging is the transformation of suffering, which is Nirodha. I mean, as we know, Nirodha literally means a container. And David Brazier in The Feeling Buddha describes it as to protect the fire from the wind and so render it safe and useful. So that transformation, or the cessation, but I prefer transformation of suffering, is Nirodha, and it is the place in which that suffering can be gathered together and taken forward in some hopefully helpful way. So that's the transformation that is a gift. And I thought about that, and then I went back to then I thought, if this is my personal transformation, if something significant is happening for me because I've been broken open, because this suffering is a gift, not only at an individual level, because I'm talking about me as an individual, does it apply at a societal level? So as a society, when we have some dreadful situation that creates great suffering, what conditions would have to exist for a transformation to come out of that, a transformation of society in this instance. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do have some thoughts, because I know it has to be a big transformation. It can't just be a small shift. Oh, let's just make things okay because something went wrong. It has to be a colossal shock to the system, and we seem to be getting lots of shocks to the system at the moment. And my friend and now George's friend Anne talks about the sixth mass extinction, and nuclear war seems to be getting closer to a reality than it has for quite a long time. And I think if we're going to have a societal transformation, it has to be big enough to undermine the processes that maintain the status quo. That seems pretty clear to me. Society needs to be vulnerable enough that those in power are not able to control it anymore, which means that those with vested interest in holding on to power need to not be able to do that anymore. And we're seeing more and more cases of authoritarian leaders who are coming in trying to hold on to power, but maybe we're getting to the point where as a society we're going to, something is going to go, pretty colossal is happening. It's going to be beyond anything that we can control. And then what's going to happen? Chaos, anarchy, maybe the new emergence of new forms. So I'm interested in that because as an engaged Buddhist, I'm interested in what's happening at a societal level, not just at a personal level. But having got to that point, I thought back to Sundari and the fact I'd had this gift, and I had a rather disturbing thought. Did Sundari need to die for me to have this transformation? Did I only have it because she died? Was it necessary? And the shocking conclusion I've come to is probably yes. And did that mean I had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo in my relationship with Sundari? And the answer to that question is, sadly, painfully, probably yes. My ego was fearful of loss of relationship. I was holding on to things. And she obviously played her part in that. It's not a one-way process. Relationships are always a two-way dance. But I do feel regret. And I want to acknowledge and apologize for that. And that's what I'm doing now. I'm sharing that with you as a sort of an apology and expression of regret. But I'm not beating myself up. I want you to know that as well. This is my learning, and I think I've learned enough from the Pure Land way that this is about contrition, not guilt. And the thing about contrition is it's forward-looking, it's not backward-focused. And that is why I'm sharing it with you. So I just want to give us a few minutes now to any reflections and any observations that you might want to share for just 5 or 10 minutes before I move on to the next topic, which is reflections on death. So this is about things I've said so far, perhaps about loss as a gift or societal level transformation. So open to you for a few minutes. I guess we should stop recording, should we?
I'll pause it. Yeah, I'll pause
Pause
it.
it. Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'm moving on. So there will be 2 more opportunities if things go according to my plan for you to reflect and come back to me on whatever is in your mind. So this next section I've called Reflections on Death. The inevitability of death enhances life. I think the fact that we know we will die enhances life. If we were never going to die, I think it'd be pretty boring, actually. That's my view anyway. And I'm interested in what we can learn from religious traditions about death and therefore life. And I'm wondering why we're afraid of death. I'm going to speculate a bit on why we're afraid of death. And then can we embrace it? Can we embrace death as a process before we actually physically die? So here's some thoughts. One of the things I've got very interested in, there's a cemetery in Sheffield called the Sheffield General Cemetery, which is nearly 200 years old now. It's no longer actively a cemetery, but it was a cemetery that was opened up for nonconformists. People who weren't Anglican couldn't be buried in Anglican grounds because it wasn't legal. So this cemetery was open. Sheffield has a lot of nonconformist Christians, used to and still does. And someone recently wrote a book about people who'd been buried in that cemetery. They analysed records about causes of death. And they wrote a book called Danger and Despair, Sudden Death in Victorian Sheffield. And I'm just going to pick out one fact because it surprised me. So this is women and girls who died in the round about the 1840s, 50s, 60s, so 150, 170 years ago. What do you think the most common cause of death was in women and girls in that period? Sudden death, most common cause of sudden death. Anyone want to speculate?
Childbirth.
It probably was high up there, but it's not what was recorded as death in this. I'll tell you. I don't think you're going to guess because I wouldn't have guessed it. Fire, death by fire. And the reason is because women in those days wore long skirts and they caught fire, and girls as well. And I think homes had open fires. And Sheffield is a city of lots of small manufacturers, cutlery in particular, and the workshops would have fires as well, open fires. And that was the most common cause of death. It's quite extraordinary. I think the reason I'm saying it is that death was always present in people's lives. I mean, it is now in our lives, but if you can turn and unexpectedly and suddenly your skirt catches fire and before you know it, you're dead, or you've been sufficiently burned, you will die. That's pretty dramatic, really. So I think death was all around, more so than it is now, actually. So that's my first point. And the second point is that the European Church, the European Christian Church, promoted hell as a likely prospect. I mean, this is what I picked up with Paripurna's talk. Death was promoted as a sort of reality in order to draw people into the Christian church to build the flock. People were deliberately scared of death because hell was what you were going to get. There was no escape. And one of the things I've discovered, one of my favorite authors now, again, Ray has sort of recommended him, is a radical Christian called Richard Holloway. I'm guessing Paripurna knows about him, but he was actually a Christian. Well, he is a Christian bishop, but he had to resign because his radical ideas became unacceptable to the Anglican Church a few years back, because he wrote a book that said you could have Christianity without God. And one of the things I've learned from Richard Holloway's book called Waiting for the Last Bus, Reflections on Life and Death, was that purgatory, we know what purgatory is, that place between heaven and hell, was actually invented in the 13th century. I didn't know that. And it was actually a place that people could go where their future was undecided. We know that. And the way Richard Holloway describes it is a moral laundromat where sinners who had soiled their souls on earth were slowly bleached of their stains and restored to purity. So it was a place that you had a second chance. But you had to be pretty rich to actually manifest that second chance, because the people who actually managed to sort of do the things that were necessary to get their relative who'd probably lived a pretty non-respectable life out of purgatory into heaven, they had to fund a special chapel, they had to pay the salary of a priest to do all the relevant prayers and things. So in that period, it was pretty likely that the ordinary person was going to be damned to hell, basically. And in that same period, again, this is Richard Holloway writing about this, the dance of death was a familiar icon in churches, in medieval churches. And the dance of death was a skeleton dancing with a carnation. The carnation flower is a symbol of death, and the skeleton is a symbol of death. And you would find that iconic imagery in medieval churches as a reminder that death was never far away. So I think it's very interesting. We were listening earlier about Honan and Shinran and their radical Pure Land Buddhism, that the Christian church eventually, not quite as early as in Japan, found the radical transformation by declaring, Martin Luther, the selling of indulgences, the privileges of the rich that could save you, but the poor were basically condemned. So that's part of the history, I think, an expectation that death's not a good thing because we've a likelihood of going to hell. I think that's still around to some extent for a lot of people. And why are we afraid of death today? We seem to spend a lot of time and effort not thinking about death. What are we avoiding? To face our own death is quite literally the last thing most of us will do if we're conscious enough at the time to do it. And it's something we do on our own. Perhaps it's the only thing in life that we cannot be accompanied into, which perhaps explains the need to believe in accompaniment by spirits into an unknown, unknowable future. I hadn't really thought of it that way. It's the only experience in life that we have to do totally on our own. We can't be accompanied. Maybe that's part of the sense of making it something we don't want to face, like I didn't want to face the absence of Sundari until she'd gone. Also, in the 21st century, in many parts of the world, dying has become the province of the medical profession, and death is not seen as a friend we might learn to welcome, but as an enemy to be resisted to the bitter end, a fight that we will eventually lose, rather than an inevitability not to be feared. So I think, the medicalization of death and the fight to save life is part of that, I think, that makes us as a culture not be willing to be open to our own deaths until probably the last moment, if then. And there's a public health saying I quite like, actually. It's sort of funny in its way. Life is a sexually transmitted disease with a mortality of 100%. You might have heard that before. Life is a sexually transmitted disease with a mortality of 100%. That sort of says it as it is, really, doesn't it? But moving on a bit, because we are Buddhists, I think our ego self is a significant factor. And for our ambition, our hopes for a self-made future, I mean, that's my experience anyway. I'm always thinking about how I want my future to be and the things in life I want to hold on to and the sense of continuity that we call a self. And as Buddhists, we know that this ego self is a delusion, but that makes it no less real for us. So one of the books that's influenced me is Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Death, No Fear, Comforting Wisdom for Life, which you may know, Thich Nhat Hanh, Zen Buddhist. And the way he expresses it, he uses the dependent origination. That's the basic idea of the continuity of life. So before life, there's nature, there's trees, sunlight, there's water, there's materials, and there's the genes of our mother, the genes of our father, and they all come to coalesce together into a life. And out of that process of all those things that come together in a dependent originating way, a baby is born. And that baby then lives a life, 70 and 10, or probably a bit longer now, maybe, but maybe not. And then that human being, that living being, animals as well, that living being dies. and then returns back to nature. So that's Thich Nhat Hanh's perspective on it. And that period between birth and death is little more than a drop in the ocean compared with the cosmos and life and the lifespan that we're just a tiny part of. And I think that puts it in perspective as well. We come from life, the natural world. We have a short time here and we go back to life from the natural world. That to me is quite meaningful, and I can relate to that. And so a bit of me wonders why, we have such trouble with it. And it did occur to me that we put ourselves through our ego cells into the center, don't we? It was a bit like the medieval church put the earth in the center of the universe, and any scientists who came along and said, no, the sun's at the center, the earth goes round it, they certainly lost their careers, and some of them lost their lives because it was blasphemy. But I'm wondering whether there's something a bit like that going on for us now in our culture. So the next thing I want to do is to share with you some writing from a book that was recommended by Carol. And it's Sandy Huntington's book called What I Don't Know About Death. And I'm going to quote quite a few bits of this, Carol. I know you know it well, because it's such a wonderful book. And the conditions under which he wrote his book was, he'd been a Buddhist pretty much all his life, from being a student onwards when he went to India. And he was now around about 70, so he'd been a Buddhist for 50 years. And he had a terminal diagnosis. He had a terminal cancer diagnosis, and he decided to write his final book when under those conditions. And the final chapter is, the final weeks, maybe days, it doesn't say, but the final weeks of his life. And I'm going to read you several extracts because they're so amazing in my view. I quickly learned to see my body as nothing more than an object to be pushed and prodded and trundled in and out of a succession of sterile, fluorescent-lit examination rooms, where it became the subject of detached scientific analysis that had nothing to do with me as a person, with my delights and passions and disappointments, all those memories of my childhood, the years in India and graduate school. None of this was relevant because I was no longer a person. I had morphed into a diseased organ. This was war, and the doctors were fighting on my side, focused on a single task. The tumors must be forced to submit. He goes on. The side effects of the lethal poisons being infused into my bloodstream are debilitating. I am constantly fatigued. I regularly slip into a sort of trance-like state defined by the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing. For as long as it lasts, I am simply erased, left with no purpose in mind, nothing whatsoever to think or do. I just sit quietly, wearied beyond belief, but somehow at peace. Even my dying no longer matters. The experience is similar to certain tranquil meditative states I've known. In this sense, it is familiar, but in another way, it's unlike any meditation I've done in the past. At those times, there was always a trace of self that remained, but in these trance-like states, I am swept away by a level of acceptance, unprecedented in my experience. I may remain like this for only a few minutes, or for half an hour or more. It always comes as a blessing, a taste of something infinitely deeper. He goes on. The chemo or the illness, it's impossible to know which, is sapping me day by day of my allegiance to the ego's motives and concerns that I now clearly see have defined me throughout my adult life. The ego's constant strategizing, its need to assert control and shape circumstances, on its own terms, its delight in accomplishment and despair in defeat. All of this is increasingly remote from and irrelevant to my present situation. The Persian poet Rumi advises us, hatch out the total helplessness inside. And that is what I'm doing, or what is being done to me. None of my ego's formidable powers has anything of value to offer me now. They are up against a power way beyond my reckoning. The ego keeps on churning out desires for more that makes it hard to find peace with the future I no longer have. And yet, as the world slips through my fingers, becoming with the passing of days ever more tenuous and insubstantial, everything about it has at the same time become frightfully precious. Every little detail, the meadow in front of our house with its tall grass rippling in the breeze, the bright yellow buttercups and the dusty blue forget-me-nots, and the mournful song of the doves at twilight, is more vivid and compelling, more real than ever before. All the old attitudes that drove me to write and study and meditate appear, from my present perspective, as tainted by ego. Anything that has to do, even peripherally, with the ego's need to turn Buddhist teachings into a vehicle for self-improvement has become a cause for pain, for the self and its unrelenting effort to turn everything to its own purpose are precisely what keeps me from finding freedom inside this prison of necessity. Love in this context is not all abstract, nor is grief. They are an all-consuming necessity. Between or within the two of them lies the realization or belated acknowledgement that I am dependent on others for my very existence and for whatever meaning and value I have managed to discover in 70 years of living. In other words, what I most need now is all that is not me. And then from the final paragraph of the book, I'm only now learning, here in this prison of necessity, to release my grip on life, and so to love life as it is, in all its beauty and horror, to give myself over to the embrace of those infinite others, human and non-human, the earth in which we are rooted, teeming with beetles and grubs and worms, the grass and flowers and trees, the robin building a nest outside my window, the hawk circling overhead, the clouds, wind, rain, and sun, all of whom have nourished and sustained me throughout this long journey home. They are in me. I am in them. We are inseparable. So it's my intention now for us to pause, or me to pause, and another opportunity for anyone who wants to reflect or comment. Namo me to boo. Okay, I'm off again.
No pressure, but
No pressure.
just take your time.
Thank
But
you.
just in case you start saying things, I wanted to make sure it's being recorded.
No, there's one more section, and this section I've called Embracing Suffering. And I want to go back to when Sundari was alive. Because I think the first time I really seriously engaged with embracing suffering was when Sundari was in considerable pain that wasn't being relieved by painkillers. The pain was high, and there seemed to be nothing that could be done, and it was really hard, difficult to be with, as you probably know, experienced, to be with a loved one who's suffering and you feel helpless. And what I decided to do was to try Tonglen meditation, Tibetan tradition. And I remember starting the Tonglen practice, which I've got some limited experience of. So I knew the basic format, but I'd never engaged with in such intense circumstances. And thinking back on it as I was sort of preparing this talk, I think what happened was my fear was that by breathing in Sundari's suffering, which is part of the practice, by breathing in her suffering, that would intensify the experience for me to the point where I would be overwhelmed. But that turned out not to be the case, because the focused attention to breathing in suffering, and then the equally focused attention to breathing out loving kindness, was settling. So over weeks and months, I held Sundari in this way from time to time. And usually actually without explicitly saying I was doing it, although I think she knew. And I'm pretty sure it was beneficial for her, sometimes particularly so. And I know it was certainly beneficial for me, that practice. It enabled me to be calmer and to feel a loving connection, so to stay connected. So Tonglen was something that is a practice that embraces suffering. And in some ways, it's quite a simple practice. I learned it from Pema Chodron's teachings. She's written about it. She's described the process. In some ways, it's quite simple, but it's really profound. And so in preparing this talk, I thought, well, I'm going to go back to Pema Chodron. I discovered a book, probably I'd bought, or Sundari and I'd bought 3 or 4 years ago, and I'd not read. And it's a book of hers called Welcoming the Unwelcome, Wholehearted Living in a Broken-Hearted World. Totally on topic. So here are some of the things that Pema says about this in her book. I'm going to give you just a few quotes, not as many as before. The wonderful irony about this spiritual journey is that we find it only leads us to become just as we are. The exalted state of enlightenment is nothing more than fully knowing ourselves and our world just as we are. In other words, the ultimate fruition of this path is simply to be fully human. The more willing you are to step out of your comfort zone, the more comfortable you feel in your life. Situations that used to arouse fear and nausea become easier to relax in. On the other hand, if you stay in the comfort zone all the time, it shrinks. Birth and death, they keep going on, continually and eternally. As we become more accustomed to this flow, we start seeing things in a fresh way. Whether distraction and aggression proliferate globally, or peacefulness and harmony grow stronger, depends on how we, as citizens of the world, feel about ourselves. So the final bit that sort of brings some things together that I want to sort of say before I really do open it up for any conversation. I had this sense, I think it goes back to Nirodha, the third noble truth, and that sense of transformation of suffering. But this sense of the Pure Land teachings setting us on fire. I mean, Hunan, Shinran, Ippen, others, they were on fire. They may have been calm, but in some sense they had fire in their bellies. They did it despite all the resistance and the things that they were tried to be stopped, banished, threatened. So that fire in the belly, set on fire into action, seems to me more important than what makes me feel safe, because I've discovered what makes me feel safe and I'm not proud about it. In a sense, it's a revolutionary spirit challenging the status quo of privilege, which is what they did, and many others who have persecuted. And it's what Sundari's spirit was too. She was astute, and she was very caring, but you know, she had that revolutionary spirit. And so I think my question to us all is, what sets us on fire? Not what keeps us calm, not what makes us safe. What sets us on fire? What are we going to take forward? What are we going? You know, what about the radical nature of Pure Land Buddhism? How do we manifest that individually and collectively? Namo Amida Butsu.